chronology. He was born in Rome. He got his first job, the Brown Arrow, at a place called Sirmium, now called Sremska Mitrovica in Serbia. He moved from there to the, that's a tan arrow up there in Milan. Oh, and I forgot he was born up there in Germany. So he went from Germany to Rome to Sirmium to Milan. He was born in Trier, and I'm not going to bore you with the dates, but please understand that there was a lot of turmoil and violence at the imperial level, including violence that took Ambrose's own father. He was raised in Rome in liberal arts tradition and lived under several different emperors, including Julian, who reneged his Christianity and tried to establish a sort of neo-pagan cult. It didn't last very long, but which shook up Christians a great deal. He was the assessor to the prefect at Sirmium. We're not exactly sure how long. Brad made up those dates in case you're checking on me. But we're not really sure how long he was in Sirmium. And he became the consularis of Milan until 314, when he was named the bishop. This is what the city of Milan looked like at the time of Ambrose. The yellow circle is the bishop's residence and the basilica. The purple is the imperial residence. Can you see I worked at this? Purple for the empire, get that? All right, never mind. The green circle is the Portiana Basilica, and the blue for St. Ambrose is the Basilica Ambrosiana, which he built and in which he is now buried. He was made bishop in 374, and again, more violence leading up to the great battle of Hadrianopolis, the second worst defeat of a Roman army in its entire history. It shook things up, and it had a seminal effect on Ambrose's understanding of the church's relationship to the state. Critical moments, I won't get you through those except to point out that De Officiis was written somewhere between the destruction of the synagogue in Callinicum. By the way, Ambrose and Milan students, be proud of yourself because you're the only people in the room who have any idea what I'm talking about right now. And in between the massacre, the synagogue at Callinicum and the massacre at Thessaloniki is about when Ambrose wrote that. So it was written between 388 and 390. It's modeled after a text by the same name, which had been written by Cicero. It's in 3 books. And it was essentially written as an instruction for his priests. And it, by the way, it serves as a very good instruction for priests. But it was also accessible and usable by any well-educated Christian elite. Dr. Winterwald confirmed that Ambrose is not particularly systematic. Would you agree to that? It is divided roughly into these 3 themes by book, but we're not going to spend too much time with it because he wasn't all that careful in his systematization. But there are certain points of note there. It probably had a long prehistory. It's a series of homilies. Officiis means duties and responsibilities, obligations, in this case associated with particular titles, like priesthood, for example. And also notice that Ambrose cites biblical passages and personalities, hardly ever pagan, traditional or legendary figures of Rome. Even though he's taken a pagan text, he's completely remanufacturing it as a Christian. His purpose, this is a quote from Monsignor Pisani's book. His purpose seems to me summed up the continuity of Rome's traditions, which had made Rome great through all the ages, remain in all their force. Tradition is not broken, but will rather continue and be perfected in Christianity, which, with its truth, will finally fulfill the claim of excellence, and that Rome will pursue to the end of the ages. Now, in 1514, we have the year that our book was published. There were a number of things going on. Pope Julius II forms a Holy League, and then he breaks that up and forms a Holy League against the former Holy League, and then he breaks that up and gets attacked by the Holy League, which was broken up by the earlier Holy League. Got that? The politics are a mess, and the violence is rampant, and the church is in the middle of it. A son of Lorenzo de' Medici becomes Pope Leo X, and a couple years after De Officiis, Martin Luther, there he is on the side there, posts the 95 Theses, which launch the Reformation. What else is going on? Oh, just look at it. Everybody from Clemente to Christopher Columbus to Michelangelo, Erasmus, Raphael, Copernicus, Thomas More, these people are all contemporaries of our book. Also, other note, just to keep us grounded historically, that picture, by the way, is the defense of Vienna, which marked the end of the expansion of Islam into Europe. Ambrose and the protesters. Luther cites Ambrose 300 times. Melanchthon is even more enthusiastic and less critical of Ambrose in his use of Ambrose. Erasmus, who is a defender of Roman Catholicism against Luther, is very interested in Ambrose. He's the first person to refer to Ambrose as the neglected father and tries to rehabilitate him for the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent cites Ambrose a whopping 2 times. Oh well. He's still neglected. Okay, that's me. Ryan, we have our context now. Please welcome our speaker, Ryan Berni.
First of all, I would like to thank the Academy and Paul, Bud, and Ethan, and everyone else here today for welcoming me. It's my first time in the US, and you've given me a very, very great welcome, and I thank you for that. No? Okay, just a few minutes. Okay. Here we go. So if in an imaginary way we could be able to travel back in time exactly 500 years, and we were to visit Venice, this extraordinary city in the northeast of the Italian peninsula, and if we could see one of its busy streets, we would probably see something that today, unfortunately, is long lost. We would see a swarm of bookshops in which printers and the librai, the shop owners, would provide customers with the best freshly printed books from their catalogues. The book we have before us today is but a small piece of a greater puzzle, the golden age of the printing press, which found in Venice its European cradle. Of course, the process of movable type printing was invented elsewhere, with some degrees of simplification. Scholars say that it was first used at Mainz by the great German goldsmith turned printer Johannes Gutenberg. During the middle of the 15th century, printing was undoubtedly a revolution, though not as swift as we may imagine. After a relatively slow spread, in which the first texts were really manuscripts that were not handwritten, the new way of producing books found in Venice its richest soil. When one thinks of the 15th and 16th century book culture in Venice, one name comes to mind, that of Aldo Manuzio, or Manutius. But if Manuzio was the most well-known among these craftsmen, who still styled themselves as artisans of the book, the downright explosion of the printed book was due to the vast crowd of Aldo's colleagues, who in different ways succeeded in exploiting the technique of movable type to eventually make it the only and most profitable way of spreading the works of classical and contemporary authors. It was a momentous turning point of which the book we are analysing today is a perfect and fitting example. But what can we concretely say about this special artifact? What stories can a text like this St. Ambrose tell us? And how can history, bibliology, the study of ancient books, and paleography shed light on a volume printed exactly 500 years ago, 2 days ago? An ancient and rare book, as this type of text is often classified in the holdings of libraries, is something in itself fascinating. Somehow its ancientness alone, to our eyes, makes it worthy of awe regardless of its contents. But a book from 1514 like this one is much, much more. It is something of a container, which, apart from enclosing the text, in our case St. Ambrose's De Officiis, also enshrines a history made of real men and women which at first glance appear to be invisible. Let's explore the matter in greater depth in order to discover who was involved in its production and who was the ultimate user of the finished product, its reader or readers, as we will discover later. First of all, let us analyze the book as an object, but I will not go into great detail about this because it will be spoken about later. The book appears to be well preserved. The binding is not a contemporary one. It's not contemporary with the date in which the book was printed, and this is not unusual. As often happened, books were sold unbound. This is a contemporary modern book, but you can see the process. And it was up to the customer or owner to bind them as they deemed appropriate. The later owners of the books, should they want to, could have the book rebound according to their personal taste or due to the book's poor preservation status. In this case, the style and colours of the binding suggest it might be much later. Whenever the book's owner wanted to bind or rebind a book, the pages of the text, which sometimes turned out to be larger than the binding's covers, were trimmed in order not to stick out of the boundaries set by the upper and lower covers. It's exactly what happened in our text. As you can see in this slide, many of the notes to the text, which are obviously written prior to the binding, are trimmed on one side, making their meaning often unintelligible. But we will talk about these notes later, as we will also examine the so-called fly leaves, sheets of paper inserted before and after the main bulk of the text, which served as a floppy cover if the book had no binding. If, on the other hand, the book did have a binding, they were used as extra leaves in which the owner could pen personal thoughts or notes to the text. But let us go back to the text features. The type used for printing this text, the font as we call it nowadays, is a type which historians of the Latin alphabet, the paleographers, call Gothic or textura. This is by no means unusual. The first printed texts were produced in order to completely resemble manuscripts. As you can see in this slide, the one on the left is a manuscript, so it's written by hand, and the one on the right is a printed book. It's actually the Gutenberg Bible, the first ever book to be printed. What changed was the means in which the text was produced, by hand in the latter case, with movable type in the former. The Gothic style of script was the last used before printing came into the picture for book hands, so printing workshops had no choice but to replicate the same font on movable types. In the first page of the text, however, we can see an element that did not appear in manuscripts and that was first introduced together with the printing press itself, but this will be discussed in greater detail later. The title page, or frontispiece. Before the invention of movable type, the frontispiece did not exist at all. In order to identify a text in a manuscript, the reader had to read the text's incipit, a brief summary of its contents written before the text itself, often in a different ink. But with the birth of printing, and moreover with the birth of the book trade, when, as we have seen, books were sold unbound, it obviously became increasingly necessary to immediately attract the customer and inform him about what he was going to buy. And this was done by means of writing the name of the author and the works contained in the book on its first page. In the case of our St. Ambrose, the title page, as you can see, is extremely spare. Only a few essential elements which immediately identify the title and author of the volume. Those were, so to say, experimental years, in which the frontispiece had just made its appearance on the scene. This element was in fact to have a long-lasting and extremely interesting life, which will develop incredibly during the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, until the title pages we have in books nowadays. You can see this is a 17th century frontispiece of Galileo's Sidero Struncius. You can see how much more complicated it is than the one in our book. A further distinctive feature of the first printed books was the colophon. a word of Greek origin which is still used today. It indicates the final part of the volume in which the reader is typically informed about the printer or workshop who produced the book and about the date and place in which it was crafted. The colophon too originates from the world of manuscript books. However, since handwritten volumes obviously did not bear the name of a printer, in manuscripts colophons were often used by the scribe to write his name, the date in which he completed his work, and often dedications or complaints about the enduring and painstaking task he or she was entrusted with. You can see an example of a colophon here, and this is what the scribe has to say after he copied the book. This work is written, Master, give me a drink. Let the right hand of the scribe be free from the oppressiveness of pain. Our book, as we have seen in the colophon, was printed by Master Gregorio de Gregori, or Gregorius de Gregoris in the Latin version of the name. Born probably around 1450 in Forlì, not far from Bologna in the Italian region of Emilia, he worked alongside with brother Giovanni, who first decided to undertake the task of being a professional printer sometime in the 1480s. During their first years in business, the two brothers moved from Forlì to various cities until they eventually decided to settle in Venice, obviously, at the beginning of the 16th century. We know they worked together until 1505, but after this date, Giovanni's name no longer appears in the colophons. Thanks to their workshop's annals, which we do possess, and which contain downright catalogues of the works the two brothers produced through the years, we know that their company was one of Venice's most important, possibly only second to that of Aldo Manuzio. The books they printed were really diverse. In 1514, the same date in which our book was produced, the two Gregori brothers became famous for printing the first book ever in Arabic type. Moreover, extant exemplars of their editions witness how their works were lavishly illustrated, an art they took to one of the highest levels in their age. Analyzing the entire production of the Gregori brothers would be interesting, but obviously beyond the scope of this talk. But we will come back to these two artisans shortly. However, in order to paint a more complete picture of the history of this book, let us now focus on its intrinsic features. As you can easily gather, this word indicates technically the characteristics of the contents of the text, an extremely useful approach while tracing the history of the volume we have here today. Let us start with the work it contains, St. Ambrose's De Officiis Ministorum, more commonly and correctly known simply as the De Officiis or De Officis. Written sometime during the period 388-390 CE, it is modelled on the homonymous work by Cicero. The Roman orator-philosopher wrote his work for his son Marcus and for a wider readership of young would-be political leaders living through the collapse of the Roman Republic. 4 centuries later, Ambrose took Cicero's De Officiis as his literary model, but addressed his treatise to his spiritual sons, the clergy of Milan and of the North Italian Church. Whereas Cicero illustrated his ideas with examples from Greco-Roman history and mythology, for his clerical audience, Ambrose chose his examples of conduct to be followed from the Bible. Even though there is little or no evidence, but possibly to support the fact that Ambrose's work is based upon sermons he delivered to his clergy in person, what we have here is a book which was to be read as a new version of Cicero's handbook for a new age. It was meant to be a manual, something that was going to be used and useful for ministers, but also to some extent to lay people and the learned. So given its classical background, it was inevitable that the De Officiis should rise to particular prominence during the Renaissance. Cicero's De Officiis was then studied and imitated more heavily than it had been during the Middle Ages, and Ambrose's work offered an obvious Christian conversation partner. It was as though Ambrose's work represented an obvious choice for what Renaissance philosophers and theologians looked for. A classical masterpiece imbued with Christian values that could constitute an ideal bridge between the two worlds. As a matter of fact, the 16th and 17th centuries saw the publication of numerous editions, at Venice, obviously, Rome, Milan, Basel, Paris, Louvain, as Christian humanists like Zell, Waldorfer, Paderborn, Auerbach, and especially the great Erasmus himself felt the obvious appeal of a text which epitomized the interface of classical and Christian learning. These observations alone would be sufficient in giving us an idea as to why our printer Gregorio decided to commit his workshop to a text such as the De Officiis. But that is not enough. We must ask ourselves if it's possible to dig even deeper. Unfortunately, we do not possess a complete list of the books printed in the Gregorian workshop around 1514. What we can do, however, is analyze the volumes printed in the workshop in years right before 1500, the so-called incunabula. It's worthy to mention that technically our book is not classifiable as an incunabula. This term is specifically referred to by scholars only for books printed between 1450 and 1500. But as we know, at a time when the printed book was spreading exponentially, but nevertheless the book trade did not have the market scope it has today, a period of only 14 years before 1514 can undoubtedly help us in making some observations. So, Ambrose. Here we go. For the years immediately preceding 1500, we know that Gregorio and his brother Giovanni produced 66 editions in total. 14 were of classical texts, 8 of a religious subject, 10 law books, no less than 31 philosophy and/or science books, only 2 by Italian authors or written in the vernacular. In particular, comparing the output of the first 3 years with that of the last 3 years, so nearer to our date, we find some very significant changes. First, they printed twice as many classics in the first period as in the second. But why is that? It could be assumed that on the whole, classics were considered the best risk as for profitability. But I think that, especially for our De Officiis, the primary concern here is the penetration of humanistic thought, and especially the revival of classics, one of the cornerstones of the Renaissance in the minds of the audience and thus of the printers. What's striking is that the classics constitute more than 1/3 of Venetian incunabula production as a whole. 604 editions, or 34% of the total, fall into that category. Moreover, and this is particularly striking in our case, if we further subdivide classical text into distinct categories, we find that after poetry, Cicero was the most popular author, no fewer than 334 editions, 200 printed in Italy, and 74 only in Venice. Let us focus on Cicero, which, as we have seen, was the chief inspiration behind Ambrose's work. What can we say about this author's works that were printed? Cicero's most popular work was the Epistolae ad Familiares, doubtless because of its practical nature as a guide for writing letters. We know that the humanists strove to imitate Cicero's epistolary style, and these were an excellent model. One must assume, though, that Cicero's oratorial writings were studied as examples of classical style, and in particular his philosophical discourses served as examples for mastering Latin, but also for their civic humanism. It's no wonder then that among Cicero's philosophical works, the De Officiis is by far the one having the most printed editions, as we can see in this slide. Economical reasons on the one side, but also an ongoing will to conform to what humanism was introducing in society and in thought, was in my opinion the main reason why Gregorio decided to print this text. We already know that Ambrose's text was the perfect candidate for combining humanism and Christianity at the highest level of learning. It contained classicism and was inspired by it, but had a Christian view to it that made the text perfectly acceptable even to church authorities. From the workshop's annals, it's also clear that from 1516 until 1520, the De Gregori brothers only printed liturgical texts, an incontrovertible sign that something was changing both in the market and in the people's taste and mentality. But that is another story. As we have seen, the choice alone of publishing a text like the De Officiis is indicative and useful in giving us information about our volume. But unlike a manuscript, a printed text is no longer a unicum. What we have discussed until now is true for all the copies of the De Officiis printed by Gregorio de Gregori spread around the world. But how can we narrow down the research even further? What can we say about this very exemplar we have with us today? Fortunately, in this respect, some tools come in handy. Though we must use them cautiously, these instruments can provide us with a somewhat truthful outline of the spread of this book in the years immediately following when it was published. Thanks to this information, we will also try to draw some conclusions regarding the possible provenance of the very book we have here today. Even though our book is curiously not cited in Grèce, one of the chief bibliographies of books printed since incunabula, we can profit from the information contained in some 50 manuscripts now preserved in the Vatican Apostolic Library. Sure enough, these manuscripts contain a list of the titles of books owned until 1603 by Italian monasteries and convents, which were drafted by the Sacred Congregation of the Index after the publication by Clement VIII of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum itself in 1596. As we can imagine, these are somehow unique lists. Just as in a photograph, we are able to know the holdings of all Italian religious houses some 80 years after our De Officiis was published. The lists concern 31 regular mail orders and sometimes also contain information regarding books used by single monks or friars. Since our volume features a long list of notes in many different hands, which we will examine later on, I consider it fitting to think that the volume must have been owned by an institution in which it could have been read and subsequently annotated by more than one person. Thus, the best place this could have happened must have been a school, a monastery, or a convent, which, as we have said, are the main focus of the survey we cited previously. Well, while searching for our volume in these long lists, which must obviously be interpreted, since they are drafted according to pre-modern bibliographical criteria, we see that little more than half a century after it was published, the De Officiis was widespread here and there in the Italian peninsula, more or less consistently throughout the north and the south. To cite but a few, the book was present in Piedmont, through Tuscany, all the way to Rome, and Basilicata to Sicily. What strikes us in the data we have here is the type of institutions which possessed the book. All but one are Franciscan houses, observant, conventual, or Capuchin. An incredibly telling element if we consider the vast range of religious orders that could have owned the book. All the Dominican foundations, for example, come to mind, together with the Benedictine or Reformed Cistercian or Carthusian houses. I repeat, no less than 6 out of 7 foundations who possessed the book only 80 years after it was published were Franciscan. The second tool we can use in order to get a precise idea of how the book was spread throughout Italy is called Edit 16, a meritorious survey of all 16th century editions that are present today on Italian soil. If we look for our De Officiis, we find something quite odd. Today, the volume is owned by many libraries, much more than the ones listed in the Vatican manuscript at the end of the 16th century. But what is most striking is that among all current owners, only one is a Franciscan convent, that of San Francesco della Vigna, in Venice, strangely enough. This can substantially mean two things. First, needless to say, that the holdings of Italian libraries have changed profoundly in the 500 years separating the two tools, even though it is extremely strange that none of the libraries cited in the Vatican list that still exist nowadays should own a copy of a book. The second fact is of a completely opposite nature. If nowadays the text is present in at least one Franciscan house among all Italian libraries, one Franciscan house, this means that the order must have had a preference for this text of some sort. Of course, considering this a conclusive hypothesis would be far from scholarly, but if we somehow cross the results we get from the two tools, and if we keep in mind what the first of them, the Vatican manuscript, has to tell us, since they are so close to the date in which the text was printed, it seems extremely likely that the text was appreciated or even printed for what I would define as a Franciscan audience. This is even more evident if we consider a particular feature, the text's classical background, which undoubtedly made it appealing to a Renaissance user base of readers, especially as it was clothed in the Christian manner, purging it of all paganism. Secondly, and this is a consequence of what we have just said, one must keep in mind the renowned attention the Franciscans had for classical culture, and so for a text so imbued with classicism as ours. At this point, let's keep in mind the observations we have made, and let's continue to analyze one of the most interesting features of the text we are called to describe today, the 400 pages that follow the printed text. Some questions come to mind. Were these pages written by someone who owned the book, or were they just notes that, as often happened in the various rebindings we spoke about before, were pasted to the book subsequently? In this case, the answer is sure. The person who penned these pages also at some stage possessed or used the book. My hypothesis is supported by the fact that from a paleographical point of view, the script of the handwritten notes we see in the slide here, at the beginning, at the end of the book, or the hand, as it is known in technical terms, is also found in some of the marginalia to the text, as we shall see in a few moments. But let us go back to the 4 handwritten flyleaves. If we are to view them with the eyes of a paleographer, that is, if we are to base our analysis entirely on the technical features of the script used by this person, we see that this handwriting completely complies with the hypothesis of a reader who was contemporary to the date in which the text was printed. In particular, what we have here is an example of script that can be dated to the first half of the 16th century. With a technical term, this script is humanistic, as it is defined. It's not exactly humanistic script as you would see in a paleography manual, because this was the interpretation of a humanistic script by a reader. Like, as we learn in school, we have an ideal alphabet, and then when we write, we interpret the alphabet in our own ways. This is why our handwriting is different. If we further analyze the technical features of this hand, we see a somewhat tidy and well-aligned page, where the lines of script are consistent and regular. This is a clue that points us towards an educated person who was presumably well-trained in the use of writing. What is missing, however, is this person's desire to make the script calligraphic. This is why it doesn't look like a humanistic script. Nor did he want to draft an official text. It seems obvious, but it's worthy to note that what we have here is a collection of personal notes that, upon the writer's own request, or at the request of someone who knew him, were bound together with a book whose contents, we believe, provoked their drafting in the first place. What can we say about the contents of these interesting pages? As I have mentioned before, the transcription of the text has often been arduous due to the difficulty in interpreting the script as a whole, the ink which in many cases has faded hopelessly, and the heavy trimming which often, like in this case, has caused many sections of the text to disappear, unfortunately, forever. In any case, the text is in vernacular Italian, the language which had been used in the peninsula for some centuries and which was slowly replacing Latin in various aspects of life. But there's more. even though I have not examined the text content in depth, while transcribing and translating the text in modern Italian first and subsequently in English, I have come across some peculiar features concerning the very language in which these notes are written. In particular, one notes how in many cases the author uses linguistic features that are typical of the Venetian area. There are many examples, such as the words soe for the modern Italian sue, se può for si può, sapemo for sappiamo, or as we can see in this slide, se devemo for we must or noi dobbiamo. I won't list all of them now, but the text is also rich in abbreviations, as you can see in this slide. The highlighted text in the slide is transcribed above. Many Latinisms are also present. For example, the frequent use of the expression verbi grazia, meaning for example, you can see it there with grazia abbreviated. What does this mean? On the one hand, but as usual, caution is mandatory. If we think about the language this person uses, we could consider the book as actually used in the Venetian area. If we also keep in mind the subject of these notes, the Trinity, some learned citations, such as that of Isaiah and of the symbol of Athanasius, and in general, the order and relative regularity in which the text is aligned, all can undoubtedly point us towards a learned and educated writer and reader, whom I do not hesitate in identifying with an ecclesiastic. The presence of this book in Franciscan houses, as we have seen, the language, the content of those manuscript notes, can all of this suggest that the volume may have been owned by a Franciscan convent in the city of Venice? Without any material evidence, such as an ownership note, this is impossible to determine. But the presence of other writers taking notes on the margins of the text, as we shall soon see, really tempts us into placing this text in a communal environment, in which many people used it and annotated its pages. Each one of them decides the passage he deemed more interesting or useful. The second